Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. I ask also unanimous consent that members not on this subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee on today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, show that ordered. As a reminder, if the members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documents@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purpose of opening statement for 5 minutes. Today, as our subcommittee will receive testimony from the Coast Guard's efforts to recapitalize its surface, air, IT, and shoreside assets, I'd like to welcome the witnesses, Vice Admiral Thomas, Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, and Shelby Oakley, Director of Contracting National Security at the United States Government Accountability Office. Vice Admiral Thomas, I understand this is the last time you'll be at this hearing, which may be a great joy to you, and so we're thankful for you. Glad you did what you did during your over 40 year, or maybe nearly 40-year career. And we really appreciate it. On behalf of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for your service to the nation. In the spirit of today's hearing, we all wish you fair winds and following the seas as you earmark on this new chapter. But before we let you go, sail off into the sunset, whatever. We're here today to discuss the Coast Guard's slow, multi-decade recapitalization program campaign. The service can count significant successes, including the near completion of its national security cutter and fast response cutter programs, though we hope to squeeze a few more fast response cutters. The Coast Guard has also made substantial investments to the shoreside facilities necessary to homeport these new assets. Unfortunately, the challenges remain despite clear articulated needs. The administration yearly budget requests consistently fall short of the resources needed to carry out the service's own recapitalization plans. Now the Coast Guard's left with the lowest appropriations for its procurement account in a decade and is facing a Grand Canyon-sized hole in the future of yearly budgets. This subcommittee has repeatedly warned that Coast Guard that it is approaching a fiscal cliff. Now it's arrived. The offshore patrol cutter moves from 1 to 2 hulls per year, starting in fiscal year 2026, and the substantial need to grow even more as soon as fiscal year 26 to keep the Polar Security Cutter program moving forward. The current budget request cannot sustain the services program in the record without a significant increase. In contrast to meager appropriations and budget requests, this committee has consistently authorized levels to provide at least a bare minimum needed to keep the service from losing even more ground. The Commandant appeared before our subcommittee 3 weeks ago, and while she was unable to commit to a timeline or cost for the Polar Security Cutter, the subcommittee commended her for recognizing the services requires at least $3 billion in procurement funding to move its programs forward. While I don't expect you to commit to a Polar Security Cutter timeline, I do look forward to learning of what programs are being made on the Coast Guard's major acquisition programs, including the Polar Security Cutter, Offshore Polar Cutter, and Waterways Commerce Cutter. Aside from surface assets, the Coast Guard's aging aviation fleet requires modernization as the service phases out the C-27 platform and replaces it with no longer manufactured MH-65s with more capability than the MH-60s. Funding need only grow. I remain concerned with the plan to reduce the total number of helicopter assets as well as the suitability for the larger MH-60 platform for specialized Coast Guard missions and cutter operations. I assure you that the committee will continue to track these transitions very closely. Finally, the Coast Guard's IT and shoreside structure are in dire need of repair and modernization. The Coast Guard's Authorization Act of 2024 provides $1.1 billion in fiscal years 2025 and 2026 to modernize the Coast Guard's shoreside structure, including substantial investments at the Coast Guard Academy and the Coast Guard's sole enlisted acquisition point at Cape May, both of which are literally crumbling. To our witnesses, thank you for participating today. Vice Admiral Thomas, as this is your last hearing before us, before you retire, I encourage you to provide us with your full, unvarnished view of how we ought to right the ship. Now recognize the...
I recognize, sir?
Well, I think so.
Okay,
So Representative Larson, you're recognized.
thanks. Thank you, Chair. I want to start by recognizing Admiral Thomas's service and his retirement as well later this month. Congratulations and thank you for your service. I also want to recognize Lieutenant Ia Carter, who's moving from the Office of Alleged Affairs, or whatever you all call it, the Coast Guard, and will be the CO at Station LA. And so then you'll just have to deal with Carbajal directly instead of all of us. So today's hearing is an opportunity for this committee to receive an update on the Coast Guard's now 17-year-old recapitalization plan. Included in this plan, the subsequent update in 2017 is the acquisition of national security cutters, fast response cutters, offshore patrol cutters, polar security cutters, waterways commerce cutters, and the HC-130J. Many of these acquisition programs have experienced significant delays and budgetary issues. For instance, the Coast Guard awarded the contract for the design and construction of 3 polar security cutters in 2019, and now 5 years later, the shipyard that won the contract has been sold, the design is only 60% complete, and the Coast Guard has not determined the delivery date or final costs for these vessels. The Coast Guard awarded the contract for 25 offshore patrol cutters in 2016, and the program is currently behind schedule and over budget. 4 cutters are currently under construction, and the service has amended the contract to move production to another shipyard after these 4 are delivered. The contract to build 27 waterways commerce cutters was awarded in 2022, but has been delayed due to a Small Business Administration determination. Further, the contractor has recently purchased a new shipyard to complete construction. These 3 acquisition programs are the largest currently underway in the Coast Guard, utilizing nearly all the procurement, construction, and improvements account, and they have a few things in common. They're all over budget, delayed, and construction will not be completed in the shipyard that was awarded the initial contract. Additionally, while the delivery of HC-130J aircraft has been well received by Coast Guard aviators, providing better range, speed, and technology than its predecessor, the program is stalled at 19 airframes due to a lack of funding. This, coupled with the unplanned retirement of the C-27 fleet, creates a large gap in Coast Guard aviation capabilities. While it's appropriate to scrutinize the Coast Guard's decisions, we in Congress must consider our own actions and the structural impediments facing the service. The service is dealing with the inadequate resources and an inadequate industrial base. U.S. shipyards are having a hard time competing in the global marketplace. This is not because our yards and workers are any less capable, but because foreign shipyards receive large direct subsidies. For instance, between 2010 and 2018, the Chinese government provided $132 billion to its shipping and shipbuilding industry. While I support the Small Shipyard Grant Program, the Title 11 Shipbuilding Program, and the Capital Construction Program, collectively these programs pale in comparison to the support other nations provide to the shipbuilding industries. Government shipbuilding becomes much more costly without a robust domestic commercial shipbuilding industry. I'm pleased that Secretary Del Toro of the Navy has directed the Navy to lead the newly formed Government Shipbuilders Council, working with the Coast Guard, the maritime industry, and NOAA, the Council seeks to bolster the commercial shipbuilding industry. Congress must strengthen U.S. shipyards, the Merchant Marine, and the Jones Act to ensure commercial business for U.S. shipyards. While I'm confident the Coast Guard will complete the ongoing recapitalization effort, I'm concerned that Congress and the administration are not prepared to provide the appropriate level of resources. Before this subcommittee 3 weeks ago, the Commandant testified that the Coast Guard PC&I account would need to be funded in excess of $3 billion annually in order to adequately cover each acquisition program. Unfortunately, that number does not include the shoreside infrastructure needs, such as piers, hangars, and repair facilities to support those new assets. Finally, we can't forget about the women and men who will be operating the new cutters and aircraft once they are delivered. The growing shoreside infrastructure backlog has real-world consequences for the women and men of the Coast Guard. I've visited numerous Coast Guard stations across the country and have seen firsthand unacceptable living conditions. No service member should be asked to live with mold or asbestos. They deserve better. Congress needs to do better. As Congress funds the construction of assets, we need to ensure that service members get the shoreside support that they deserve. This includes workstations, housing, healthcare, and childcare. So with that, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding this hearing and look forward to the testimony ahead. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Representative Carvajal, ranking member. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations, Ia Carter, on your upcoming post in the state of California, what many call paradise. We only accept the best of the best, so you're going to fit right in. Congratulations. And to Admiral Thomas, thank you for your service to our nation. I wish you the best in your upcoming retirement, and really appreciate all the contributions you made to the Coast Guard over the years. So congratulations on your upcoming retirement as well. Before we get started into the substance of today's hearing, I'm compelled to express my disappointment again with the newest account of the Coast Guard's handling of Operation Fouled Anchor. The latest disturbing revelation by the former sexual assault and response coordinator at the Coast Guard Academy details a disturbing and blatant disregard for victims in an effort to protect the reputation of the Coast Guard. If the Coast Guard wants to mend its reputation, it must commit to real transparency and real accountability, which includes the senior leadership. The Coast Guard is a great organization, but those who have dedicated their life to service deserve better. The Coast Guard is in the midst of recapitalizing cutters, boats, airplanes, helicopters, shoreside infrastructure, and information technology. In recent years, in almost every case, the procurements have been over budget and over schedule. While it is important to recapitalize and modernize Coast Guard assets, we must address the ongoing production issues to ensure a timely and cost-effective delivery. The Government Accountability Office, or GAO, has reported several times that the acquisitions of new Coast Guard assets routinely come in delayed and over budget. This is a concerning trend, particularly for a small and under-resourced service that is forced to rely on aging and obsolete assets to conduct its missions. Improving the acquisition program requires investment so the Coast Guard can bolster its oversight and create internal capabilities. It also requires investing in U.S. shipbuilding to ensure we have shipyards capable of building the assets we need. U.S. shipyards depend on contracts from the Navy and Coast Guard to support their business. But the Coast Guard is oftentimes outbid by the size and value of Navy contracts. Recently, this has forced the Coast Guard to rely on on shipyards that lack experience with government contracts. We cannot rely on the Coast Guard to be the subsidizer for the ship industry. Time is of the essence to bring on new cutters, shoreside infrastructure, and IT systems. Not only do modern assets mean improved mission readiness, but they also mean better quality of life for all our coasties. Service members want their families to live in the best quality housing and want to work in buildings that are not falling down around them. That starts with investing more in shoreside infrastructure and eliminating the estimated $3 billion backlog. Ultimately, Service members deserve to live and work in places that are not on the brink of failure. Congress and Coast Guard leadership owe it to the personnel to deliver this. I have visited countless Coast Guard stations where buildings are either damaged, outdated, or completely unusable. I have said it before and I will say it again. We must fund the Coast Guard at the level significantly higher than requested and appropriated in recent years. I welcome the Commandant's push to be a $20 billion agency by 2030, including a need to more than double the procurement and construction and improvements account, otherwise known as PCI&I. Even GAO has recognized that the funding typically requested by the Coast Guard underestimates their need for recapitalization by more than $800 million each year. All signs point to the need to fund the Coast Guard at higher levels. I was heartened to see the House appropriation mark include a $500 million above the budget request for the PC&I account. That is a step in the right direction. But future PC&I funding must match or exceed $3 billion per year as reflected in the Coast Guard Authorization Act and the Commandant's recent statements. I hope this hearing continues to shed light on the growing resource gap, and this serves as a wake-up call. With that, I yield back. With 1 second to spare.
With 1 second to spare, yes. I would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, take a moment to explain our lighting system. Green means go, yellow means slow down, and red means stop. That's it. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses their full statements be included in the record without objection, so that ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions they may have submitted to them in writing. Without objection, show that ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days, that any additional comments or information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. So as your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, we're going to stop. And so we're going to adjourn till the votes are done. If y'all can come back, that would be fantastic. And we're in recess. Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Marine Transportation, Maritime Transportation will reconvene in previously recessed hearing. We'll now turn to our witnesses. Your written testimony has been made a part of the record. Subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Vice Admiral Thomas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Webster and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My testimony, I believe, has been entered into the record. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on the Coast Guard's ongoing activities to recapitalize the service's assets and capabilities and continue to meet increasing mission demands across the nation and around the world. On behalf of the Commandant and the entire Coast Guard workforce, I express my sincere appreciation for your oversight and for your support of our service. In response to ever-increasing demand for the Coast Guard unique capability, we anticipate a need over the next 2 decades to field new, more capable assets and expand our enduring presence in critical areas like the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific without reducing our domestic capabilities. We must also build new C5I infrastructure and grow our workforce to operate and maintain these assets. To do this, the Coast Guard must continue investing in a multi-billion-dollar acquisition portfolio to meet mission needs of today and tomorrow. The Commandant requested that I reiterate the service's sincere thanks for this committee's support of her efforts to become the Coast Guard the nation needs with an authorization of $3.4 billion in PC&I funding. We greatly appreciate your support. This subcommittee has been a great advocate for the Polar Security Cutter, one of our service's top 2 acquisition priorities. The PSC acquisition continues to move forward, and I'm optimistic that the design will mature to the degree the service can authorize start of construction later this year. The service's other top acquisition priority is the Offshore Patrol Cutter, and the OPC celebrated a milestone last year with the launch of OPC-1 Coast Guard Cutter Argus. There's still much work to be done before Argus is delivered, but we are eager to deploy these new cutters to replace the aging medium endurance fleet. In addition to those major cutters, our oldest cutters are our inland tenders, some of which were built during World War II and all of which need to be recapitalized. The Waterway Commerce Cutter will replace those ships, and we recently ordered long lead time material for the initial WCC. The service is also keenly focused on continued investment in our aviation fleet to meet the mission demands of today and tomorrow. The expansion of the MH-60T fleet is critical as the MH-65 approaches end of service life. The HC-130J is the Coast Guard's largest and most capable aircraft, and the service recently took delivery of our 17th C-130J. Number 18 and 19 are still in the acquisition process, and we need your support to complete our existing program of record of 22 aircraft. As the subcommittee is well aware, the Coast Guard has significant needs across our shore infrastructure portfolio. We are focused on conducting the planning necessary to make well-informed requests in future years to address concerns across the service, including at our critical accession points, Training Center Cape May, and the Coast Guard Academy. The service remains committed to building the fleet of the future and delivering systems capability that will maximize return on investment. To advance the service's recapitalization efforts and properly plan to meet the mission requirements, we must have stable, predictable funding. Our Commandant has stated our Coast Guard must be a $20 billion organization by 2033, and in line with your recent $3.4 billion PC&I authorization, we need at least $3 billion annually in recapitalization dollars. However, we are constrained by fiscal limits, and increasing operating and sustainment costs restrict our ability to invest in recapitalization. As the Commandant has said, most of our recent funding increases have gone to running the service of today, not to building the service for tomorrow. The Coast Guard recognizes your efforts to change that paradigm, and we look forward to working with you to ensure the service continues to field the capabilities and the personnel necessary to meet our nation's demands. And Congressman Carvajal mentioned yesterday's hearing and the recent revelations by our former sexual assault response coordinator at the Coast Guard Academy. And Congressman, I just wanted to take this opportunity to speak directly to the victims who may be out there or folks who may know victims out there, because the most concerning part of that report was the potential that some victims have not been able to access the health care that they need through the VA. And we have and we continue to stand ready to assist any victims access to healthcare efforts. And I personally am ready to do that, but we also have an enterprise victim advocate that can help any victims out there. So thank you for your support. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Now we turn to Ms. Oakley. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about challenges with Coast Guard's acquisition portfolio affordability. My testimony today should not be a shock to anyone. The Coast Guard's acquisition portfolio is unaffordable given historic and predicted budgetary levels. We have been consistently reporting this for over 10 years. The Commandant recently testified that while the Coast Guard's budget request included nearly $1.6 billion to recapitalize assets, in fact, up to $4 billion is what is actually required. While Coast Guard has the lion's share of responsibility for the budget predicament they are in, others play an important role too. This includes OMB and DHS, as well as congressional decision makers. As a result, my statement today will focus on two main areas. First, I will cover the actions the Coast Guard can take to improve the portfolio's affordability. Second, I will raise key questions that decision makers need to address if they want to begin tackling these challenges. From where I sit, I see two main areas the Coast Guard needs to improve. First, Coast Guard needs to do better when it comes to managing cost growth and schedule delays on its major acquisition programs. This includes the high-priority PSC and OPC programs. These programs are now collectively costing $13 billion more than initially planned and are 4 to 5 years behind schedule. These outcomes make affordability challenges worse. They extend the need for resources and prolong the wait for new and necessary capabilities. Second, Coast Guard needs to better articulate the full scope of its funding needs and identify trade-offs that will be necessary when and if those needs cannot be met. The Coast Guard and DHS have consistently kicked the can down the road and have not taken steps to realistically lay out a plan for meeting its mission needs outside of the constrained budget process. 10 years ago, we recommended that the Coast Guard develop a 20-year fleet modernization plan that identifies all assets necessary to meet its missions and the funding needed for those assets. Similarly, in 2019, we recommended the Coast Guard include supporting details about trade-off decisions in congressional budget requests and related reports. Coast Guard has yet to address these recommendations, in part because of limitations imposed by OMB and DHS. I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the Coast Guard operate in its planning without constraints. That's necessary. What I'm suggesting is that without the Coast Guard identifying what it needs to fund the ships, aircraft, and infrastructure it needs to meet its missions, now and in the future, decision makers are left with limited insight. This precludes them from making tough decisions to prioritize and fund programs essential to the Coast Guard's missions or to advocate for additional resources. Speaking of decision makers, that brings me to my next point. Coast Guard does not make budget requests in a vacuum. It must align with the President's top-line budget numbers, which are set by OMB and DHS. Congressional decision makers have tried to help by consistently funding programs on the Coast Guard's unfunded priorities list. The Coast Guard has come to rely on this as a way to get more resources, and this can take decisions about priorities out of the Coast Guard's hands. Decision makers will have to eventually address difficult decisions about the affordability of the Coast Guard's portfolio. First, what can the Coast Guard do to improve management of its acquisition programs and achieve better cost and schedule outcomes? Second, when will the Coast Guard develop a long-term plan that can inform trade-off decisions? Third, which programs may need to be cut, reduced, or deferred? Finally, what gaps or reductions in mission capability will operators and the public face due to these challenges? We have 16 open recommendations to the Coast Guard that could help answer some of these questions, and the Coast Guard should prioritize implementing them. For example, holding programs accountable to stabilizing ship designs before proceeding with construction is in line with leading practices and will result in better cost and schedule outcomes. That is a decision that is facing the PSC program in the near future. Again, none of these questions are new, but they are even more critical today as the Coast Guard's budget will be increasingly consumed by programs like OPC and PSC in the coming years. Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Carbajal, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my oral statement. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you for your testimony. I really appreciate that. And now comes questions. I'll yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Admiral Thomas, prior to the hearing, this committee requested an updated 5-year capital improvement plan, but we were told basically don't expect it. So I was wondering, as a result, we're kind of relying on an old one back in 2022. As we explore throughout this hearing circumstances, have changed the, since fiscal year 2023. Why can't the Coast Guard produce an updated capital investment plan?
Mr. Chairman, we owe you an updated SIP. We are working through the department right now. I expect to have the 24 SIP to the committee by this summer, and we've already begun work on the FY25 SIP. So we have that for action, sir.
Will it be before you leave?
Not much is going to happen between now and when I leave, but it will happen this summer.
Ms. Oakley, anything you'd like to add? Why the CIP important to the acquisition planning process?
Yeah, I mean, the SIP at least provides some information beyond the current budget year in terms of what the Coast Guard's priorities are and what it's looking to fund, but it doesn't provide the necessary information that matches what's realistically going to be attained in the budget. And so the SIP is kind of the perfect example of looking at that kind of bow wave of funding that's going to be required in the out years. And so I think we have some open recommendations to the Coast Guard to really take a look at improving the information included in the SIP that includes better information on the risks that are being accepted by the decisions, and then identifying realistic resources that are needed to address the acquisition program priorities. And I would encourage the Coast Guard to incorporate those as they're working on the future SIPs.
Admiral Thomas, Coast Guard reported challenges in meeting mission demands, including the $1.77 billion that is there in the backlog. What's the minimum amount of annual funding needed for the Coast Guard to prevent the growth of the total shoreside infrastructure backlog?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this committee's continuous focus on our shore infrastructure, because it is as critical to our mission success as anything that floats or flies. We have a shore infrastructure portfolio valued at about $24 billion. Industry standards would say you need to invest 2 to 4% of your infrastructure portfolio each year to maintain it. For us, that would mean steady, regular O&S funding at around $500 million. That would allow us to get after our maintenance backlog. And then, of course, we would need the PC&I money to do the recapitalization and new infrastructure that we need.
You have a long-term plan to modernize your shoreside infrastructure. Does it include efforts to modernize the process by which the Coast Guard plans, designs, and builds shoreside infrastructure?
We do. We are currently in the midst of modernizing our civil engineering program, and one of the key aspects of that is to ask Congress for more money to do survey and design work so that we can then come back with more realistic requests for what it's going to take to do our shore infrastructure upgrades and maintenance.
Do you think that will live within the confines of the President's overall total?
I'm sorry, Congressman? I didn't quite catch that.
Do you think that the all you just said will live within the confines of the President's overall request?
I think our commandant has said we need to be a $20 billion Coast Guard, and until we're there, we're not going to be able to get after any of these backlog numbers.
Ms. Oakley, Would you like to respond to that also?
I mean, 2.6 billion is quite a significant backlog, and, I think that only includes costs of projects that have cost estimates. And there's about 200 plus more projects that are still to be estimated that continue to add to that backlog, not to mention additional shoreside infrastructure that will be required for new mission sets like in the Arctic that need to be considered as they're making decisions about how to fund and how to dig out of that hole and build for the future. So it's important work, and I know we're doing some work for you all to update some of our work from 2019 and provide you with new data on, what those numbers are from a shoreside perspective. So look for that in the coming months.
Well, my time has run out, so Mr. Carbajal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Oakley, the Polar Security Cutter and Offshore Patrol Cutter programs are both behind schedule and over budget. On both programs, complications have arisen due to an immature level of design. While the Coast Guard generally follows the Navy standards for design completion before moving to production, what is the effect of starting construction before obtaining a mature design?
Excuse me. Put simply, the lack of knowledge leads to decisions to move forward that aren't well informed about what the resources or risks are going to be associated with the effort. And so when you think about it from the perspective of, you wouldn't start building your house before it's been designed, right? And so very simply, those are the kinds of decisions that we're talking about. And so we've been recommending for many years to both the Coast Guard and the Navy to put in that early effort, put in that early time to really understand that basic and functional design, what the structure is going to look like, where the major systems are going to be, how the piping is going to run through the ship, to be able to then have confidence as you're stepping into the construction period for those ships, where it becomes more expensive to make changes that might be necessary as the design continues to evolve. And I think that unfortunately, when you see bad outcomes, it's a result of continuing instability in the design that's leading to changes that become increasingly expensive as you move through the construction process.
Thank you. It sounds like the F-35 in the House Armed Services. Admiral Thomas, each of the new assets we've discussed today will require experienced Coast Guard service members to operate and maintain them. It is critical that we pair these investments with initiatives to address the 10% personnel shortage that the Coast Guard is facing. How will the new assets and investments in infrastructure further Coast Guard's efforts to recruit and retain a diverse cadre of personnel? And what else is the Coast Guard doing to ensure its workforce is sufficient to manage these assets and carry out its missions?
Well, thank you for that question, Ranking Member Carbajal. Absolutely, the workforce is what makes these assets come to life and get the mission done. One of the things that we can do to improve our retention and recruiting is to provide world-class shore infrastructure for our forces to work in. I think Congressman Larson mentioned he's visited a number of areas where the conditions that we're asking our people to work in are just substandard. That doesn't help us retain our workforce. I'm happy to report we're making progress with our recruiting. We're at record numbers this year, numbers we haven't seen since prior to COVID, and our retention is up as well. So we're working on closing that workforce gap. But the fact of the matter is we do not currently have the capacity at our session points to meet the future workforce demands of our service. We cannot get enough people through Cape May each year without building infrastructure there, and we cannot get enough people through the Coast Guard Academy each year for our future needs without improving the infrastructure there.
Thank you. Ms. Oakley, the Polar Security Cutter program is now over 5 years behind its initial schedule, in part due to challenges associated with its shipbuilding programs. These delays are associated with $2 billion in cost increases. How important are investments in commercial U.S. shipyards and shipbuilding to ensure cost efficiency for the Coast Guard and the Navy? And how else can the Coast Guard improve its shipbuilding outcomes?
Well, in general, supporting the U.S. shipbuilding industrial base is critical given what both the Coast Guard and the Navy are trying to do in terms of building up their fleets to meet their increasing mission demands. One thing that I would like to comment on that is that I see this as needing to be a whole of government approach to supporting that industrial base. And in preparing for this hearing, I'm reviewing the Navy's 30-year fleet shipbuilding plan, and it talks a lot about industrial base and supporting the naval industrial base and the commercial industrial base, but the Coast Guard isn't mentioned in there at all. And so I think that's one thing that the Navy and the Coast Guard need to think about is how they can kind of approach and attack this holistically, because there is a lot of money right now being thrown at the shipbuilding industrial base through the Navy and through the Department of Defense in particular. And so I think that the Coast Guard will benefit from that. But I'd like the Coast Guard to be a little bit more strategic in directing those benefits to things that will support them in the long run. And then just to quickly answer your question about improving outcomes, the Coast Guard should really look toward the practices that we've identified by going out and looking at commercial shipbuilders and buyers and how they go about getting ships done on time and on budget and on a predictable cycle. And I don't mean done in 10 years. I mean done, designed to launched in less than 4 years sometimes for very complex ships. There's a reason why they can do that, because they take disciplined approaches, they put in place the right kinds of tools, they have the right kinds of expertise to be able to oversee these programs and execute these programs. And that's where I direct both the Coast Guard and the Navy to begin looking to improve their outcomes.
Thank you. And I'll be following up, sitting on House Armed Services on this collaborative shipbuilding issue. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Hazel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today. We appreciate it. My priorities are the same they were the last time we had our hearing here. Congress must do all it can to help the shipbuilding industry by ensuring efficiency and transparency, bolstering the workforce, and incentivizing domestic shipbuilding. Ms. Oakley, what are the 3 top actions that Congress can take to help address the affordability challenges the Coast Guard is facing now?
There's a couple of things. First, the Congress should really enforce what it's asked the Coast Guard to do. Develop a 20-year fleet modernization plan so that you all have the ammunition to be able to advocate for additional resources for the Coast Guard to be able to meet its increasingly its increasing mission needs. So that's one thing. The Coast Guard has yet to develop that type of plan. The Navy develops one every year. So that I don't see that there should be any reason why the Coast Guard couldn't follow suit to provide y'all with that information. The second thing I would say is that the Congress should demand the Coast Guard to push forward with disciplined programs. And when I say disciplined programs, I mean following those practices that I was talking about from the commercial ship buyers and builders, not making decisions to proceed with construction with a design that's not even remotely finished to be able to support informed decisions in that regard, and really push the Coast Guard to think about what it needs and how it's going to effectively prioritize and assess the risks associated with its future portfolio. And it can do that in that long-term plan, or it can do that in that SIP that we talked about earlier, that capital investment plan. So those are just some quick things that I think you all could do.
Thank you very much. Admiral Thomas, how do you respond to the claims that the Coast Guard has a lot of red tape? And can you describe what some of the changes you are making to make this more people want to bid on these contracts? You know, help us get here.
Congressman, I would say that the red tape in the Coast Guard is the red tape that's in federal law, regulation, and requirements from our department. The Coast Guard is one of the premier agencies in all of government that does business with small businesses. And I am proud of that fact. We work hard to ensure that we can send our business to small businesses.
Very good. How can this committee better equip the Coast Guard with the tools it needs to provide detailed and accurate information relating to communication and transparency in the acquisition process? How can we help you?
I would have to have a conversation with you, Congressman, to understand where you think there's a lack of communication and transparency. I think the key is in our budget requests.
Okay.
And that's where your frustration lies. And, our budget request for FY24, particularly in our PC&I, was, we asked for a lot more than we got.
Okay, got it. In your testimony, you mentioned the recent acquisition of the nation's first heavy polar icebreakers in over 4 decades. How do you plan to navigate this process and meet deadlines since no shipyard has built an icebreaker in all these decades?
Yeah, so that's a very key point, and I'm glad that you brought it up. The polar icebreaker is not like any commercial vessel ever built, and it's not like any vessel built in the United States ever. So it's a complex vessel, and it's a complex. We're currently working with the shipyard. They've put in what's called a request for equitable adjustment to kind of right-size the contract. That combined with the work we're doing to understand their over-target budget, over-target schedule analysis, I think will allow us to report to this committee a good estimate in both cost and schedule by this fall.
Thank you. Yeah, we toured down there recently a few months ago, and it was really neat to see the innovation that's going on in Bollinger down there. So thank you very much for that. The last question is for the panel, if we have time. This committee has heard that one of the challenges in building PSC is the support of the local industrial base, that is finding enough workers. What can we do to try to help, everybody, I guess you'd say, because we hear that all over the place. We're having problems finding people. What can we do to help that?
So I think there's 2 things that we need to do. One is we need to invest in our shipyards, and we need to understand that the polar security program will result in ships that our nation needs, but it will also result in a shipyard that our nation needs. And the second is we need to really invest in STEM education. We are finding that the engineers, the scientists, the technicians that are required to put a ship that complex together, both in terms of design and construction, just don't exist in our nation. So we need to focus on that.
Thank you, and thank you for all your testimony and your hard work. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Sholton.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to our witnesses for being here, Vice Admiral Thomas, for your service to our country. I have a number of questions today, so I'm going to get right into it. First, the Great Lakes play a vital role not only in our local communities, but and back home in West Michigan, but within the U.S. economy as a whole. These waterways are critical to ensuring reliability of supply chains and the integrity of our country's maritime border. As such, I want to be as helpful as I can to support adequate icebreaking in the Great Lakes to allow for free movement of cargo in the region year-round. While we've had minimal ice this particular year, next year is a different story. Vice Admiral, despite receiving $20 million in FY24 and over $19 million in previous years, the Coast Guard has not officially designated a new heavy Great Lakes icebreaker as acquisition in this program of record. Given the importance of the region, is there anything preventing the Coast Guard, sir, from accelerated acquisition of an additional icebreaker beyond access to funding?
Congressman, I share your passion for the Great Lakes. It is a national treasure, and we are committed to recapitalizing our system of icebreakers there. We think we need 2 heavies, about 11 mediums, and about 7 of the smaller ones, so we can essentially plow the highways, the side roads, and the parking lots. We are moving forward. We're at ADE 1, Acquisition Decision 1, with the GLIB, the Great Lakes Icebreaker. The money that was appropriated in FY24 will allow us to move forward with the analyze and select phase. We're going to need additional appropriations to move forward with that particular acquisition, but it is a program of record. We have a program office, and we're moving forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that, sir. I appreciate this discussion, and frankly, I had a lot more questions today that I was hoping to talk about with respect to the GLIB program, but unfortunately, the U.S. Coast Guard is once again in the headlines for horrible mishandling of sexual assault cases related to Operation Fouled Anchor. I would be remiss if I didn't ask some questions here. First and foremost, sir, while the Coast Guard has been before this committee and other committees many times talking about the tragedy of the impact on these victims. Sir, is the Coast Guard leadership aware of the impact on everyday citizens that distractions like these continue to have over and over again? You know, the subject matter of today's hearing is, you know, where we are behind on so many of these different programs, and I can't help but notice we're not able to get to the questions that we need today because we are also talking about yet another scandal. Does the Coast Guard appreciate the lack of fiscal responsibility as well that scandals continue to have on the program itself?
First, Congresswoman, let me just offer you an in-person brief on GLIB so we can answer all your questions.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate your recognition that the ongoing disclosures regarding sexual assaults and unacceptable behavior in the Coast Guard can be a distraction, not just for our service and our service members, for the nation, because they lose focus on all the goodness that is in our service. That's why we are really focused hard on improving and strengthening our service culture, providing all the support that we can to victims. I mentioned earlier that I stand personally ready to help victims access the health care that they need at the VA, and we have an enterprise victim advocate to do that, but you're absolutely right. It can be a distraction, and it can take away from the good story of the Coast Guard.
And sir, I appreciate your comments. You know, as everyone here knows, and as we heard in the testimony in the Senate, unfortunately, these most recent allegations were about how, you know, these instances are continuing to be ongoing. And I'm wondering what the Coast Guard is doing to ensure transparency in the process so that the American public can trust that what you're saying now is true, you know, that even as we speak, that there are not cover-ups like this happening.
You know, our commandant has testified, and you can choose to assess the veracity of her testimony, that she is absolutely committed to being transparent. I personally am responsible for a sexual assault prevention and response program. I spend a lot of time working on it. And, you know, we are being as transparent as we possibly can.
I don't mean to interrupt you, sir. I have one more very important question, and I would ask you that, you know, we have heard a lot of words, and I think the American public and this committee, I know I personally am going to need a lot more than words to assure us of the veracity of these assurances that there will these will continue to be taken seriously. One of the most horrifying details, I think, to come out of this is that victims were not provided with the CG 6095 that would ensure access to VA health benefits. I think it goes without saying, sir, that survivors should never be denied benefits in an attempt to help the Coast Guard protect its reputation. What are you doing to ensure that every survivor, both in the past and in the future, even those we don't yet know about, is provided with a CG 695, ensuring their access to benefits?
So I have a CG 695 right here. We do provide
Do the
them.
survivors have it, sir, is the question.
So we have an enterprise victim advocate that's available to survivors who can get access to this form. Our sexual assault response coordinators around the Coast Guard have access to the form. And this week, I will re-communicate both internally and externally through social media where victims can go to get these forms so that we can assure that they get the care that they deserve and that they need.
I would ask that you provide a more proactive approach to make sure that these survivors have actually accessed these forms, sir.
We will, Congresswoman, including outreach to known victims. We've done that over the course of the last year.
Our personnel, our coasties across the country are the most precious resource that the Coast Guard has, sir, and we ask you to look out for them in every possible way. I yield back the remainder of my time.
It's my greatest
Time's
privilege to work
expired.
out for
Thank you very
our
much.
workforce.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And first off, I'd like to say how much Southeast Texas, where my district is, appreciates all the hard work that the Coast Guard has been doing in responding to our recent storms in Southeast Texas. I have 5 or 6 of my counties have been declared disaster, as well as several other congressional districts. My question is to you, Admiral, as the Coast Guard looks to transition to the MH-60 rotary wing fleet, I understand that the Coast Guard is slowly phasing out many of its aging MH-65s with the intention of reducing the overall rotary wing fleet. Air Station Houston currently hosts 3 MH-65 Dolphin helicopters, and I understand that the current plan is to phase these 3 helicopters out and replace them with just 2 MH-60s. And while I recognize that the MH-60 is a very capable platform compared with the MH-65, I have concerns that reducing the number of airframes in service may impact the Coast Guard's operational capabilities. Presumably, with just 2 aircraft at Air Station Houston, it would be more challenging to respond to multiple search and rescue missions, storm responses, or providing support to the Houston Ship Channel, given that a single helicopter can only be in one place at one time, with the reality that individual helicopters are often stuck in the hangar dealing with maintenance issues. In addition, for Air Station Houston, I understand there may be some issues regarding the hangar size and space and ability to facilitate the 60s. Do you have any information available on the plan moving forward at Air Station Houston's air assets? Briefly, if you would.
Yeah, so Congressman, I'll just say I'm familiar with high water events in Southeast Texas. I was in command in Galveston when Allison hit, and I was in command of the 8th District when Harvey hit, and we saved tens of thousands of people using aircraft from Air Station Houston and surged in aircraft from, in the most recent event, Air Station Houston was able to medevac a 12-hour-old baby to neonatal care who was isolated by the flood. So Air Station Houston is an asset for that area, and we will continue to fly our aircraft out of there. We will have to make some modifications across the country to our hangars in order to accommodate the 60s. It's another reason why we need a $3 to $3.4 billion PC&I budget so we can build the aircraft and the hangars.
So it's a funding issue.
It's
You
absolutely.
just don't have the funds to get more than 3.
Right now, we have a program of record of 127 60s. If we're going to grow that, it's going to require more funds.
Considering the pending Polar Icebreaker construction program, I understand the construction contracts for the Polar program and the Great Lakes program require all United States laws to be followed. Has the question of propulsion arrangement and patent rights been resolved in the case of the Polar program? And if not, why not? And how do you propose to resolve that question so that lawsuits and further delays do not occur?
So to date, there has been no official raising of patent issues associated with the Polar Icebreaker. So we haven't taken any actions to resolve those because they just haven't made any claims.
Okay. As the Coast Guard explores ways to make the most of its limited funding, operation, and procurement of long-range air assets presents a significant challenge. The Coast Guard currently collaborates with CBP regarding the use of long-range autonomous systems, including the use of Coast Guard pilots and the use of systems in key areas of Coast Guard operation. Given the ability of these systems to expand the Coast Guard's ability to monitor large areas in a cost-effective manner, the fact that the HC-130J program appears stalled at 19 airframes and the apparent shift away from the C-27 program, does the Coast Guard plan to explore the acquisition of its own long-range UAS systems? And what sort of unmanned systems could provide the Coast Guard with more complete, persistent marine domain awareness?
Yeah, we absolutely need to move into unmanned systems, particularly for our maritime patrol missions. We have in FY25 budget, we have about $100 million aimed just at doing that. We do operate the MQ-9s with CBP. We think that's probably the platform that we need as we build out our fleet. But we're also going to need to build more than our current program of record of C-130s because we are sunsetting the C-27s.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate you very much. We certainly need to up our ante on, I know you need the funding, but we've got to have enough airframes to get things done. So with that, I will yield myself back and recognize the gentlewoman from Alaska, Ms. Peltola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first questions are for Admiral Thomas. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service to our country. The Coast Guard has previously said that the acquisition of the Polar Security Cutter, which you've mentioned a little bit ago, is the Coast Guard's top acquisition priority. And ensuring that the program stays on track and that the Coast Guard has the resourcing it needs to oversee that program while staying on top of recapitalization priorities in all your other places is one of my top priorities as well as a member of the House. In a Homeland Security hearing a few weeks ago, the Coast Guard indicated that the design for the Polar Security Cutter was about 65% completed. And I'm wondering when you estimate being able to begin the construction phase, and do you have an updated estimate for when the first Polar Security Cutter will be off the assembly line in the water and ready to go?
So we're in the process of getting much greater clarity on both cost and schedule, and I think we'll have that this fall. We're working with the contractor, both in terms of renegotiating portions of the contract, but also at analysis they're doing to look at their cost and schedule. That said, we have seen a increase in design maturity that leads us to be optimistic about being able to authorize start of construction by the end of this year. I will say that I don't think we'll be a 90% design maturity. That term, design maturity, is defined differently in different places, but we'll certainly be at the level of maturity that we need to start the modules that we start. So we're optimistic we'll start this year.
Okay, that is good news. And are you able to provide an update on the acquisition of the commercially available icebreaker that the Coast Guard received funding for in the FY24 appropriation cycle?
Yeah, well, first of all, we appreciate the support of Congress to get the money to acquire a commercial icebreaker that will increase our ability to be present and to match presence with presence in the Arctic, so and particularly off of Alaska. The next step is a request for a proposal that we're working on. There's one sole source. We're going to see what we can actually buy for the $125 million that we got. But critical, we asked for about $20 million in O&S funding so that we can outfit and operate that vessel. And in FY24, that was reduced to $1 million. So we're going to need an additional appropriation FY25 so that we can operate what we buy.
Okay, that is a very good heads up. And one of the things my office is tracking are the 3 major home porting projects currently in Alaska. And I like to remind people that if Alaska were a country, we'd be the 18th largest country. So, and we have more coastline than all of the lower 48 combined. At low tide, Alaska could fit through this 3 Texases inside of us. So we're enormous, and really, you are our presence. And we know that we've had foreign adversaries practicing war drills in our waters off our shores, and we really appreciate you being there and the presence of the Coast Guard. And that's not even to mention the search and rescue operations that you provide. It seems like every week or multiple times a week. As Alaskans, we're very dependent on you. Our fishing industry is dependent on you. Our tourists are very dependent on you. So regarding the 3 major home porting projects, there's a fast response cutter headed to Seward, there's a fast response cutter headed to Sitka, and the commercially available icebreaker will be home ported in Juneau. And I'm wondering if you could give us an update on how those projects are going.
Absolutely. I've been focused on our Alaska projects. Our crews love to work and live in Alaska. And so in Seward in particular, we have acquired the property that we need. We requested about $42 million to build out the FRC facility there. We've been appropriated about $25 million. We think we can put a pier there. We probably can't put the support buildings there that we need for that. So we're going to need additional appropriation there. The challenge in Seward is that we need to build housing as well. And although we've gotten appropriated about $13 million to do that, that will get us property and utilities. It won't actually build us homes. We're working with the community there and community builders. In Sitka, we have enough money to build the FRC pier and recapitalize the buoy tender pier, but not enough yet to build the buildings ashore. And we're still working our way through negotiations with regard to acquiring the land. With regard to Juneau, there's not been any appropriations to build a home port in Juneau. And so we haven't even begun the planning process there.
Okay, thank you for that update. In Admiral Fagan's State of the Coast Guard speech last year, she said that the American taxpayer won't find a better return on investment than the U.S. Coast Guard, and I agree with her. And I have a continued frustration by the size of the Coast Guard's budget year after year. I am a big proponent of making investments where they need to be made. I've heard some say that the Coast Guard should be about a $20 billion organization, as you mentioned earlier. In a world where the Coast Guard were to receive a major uptick in funding, what are some of the acquisitions or initiatives that the additional funding would be spent on?
So I've said that the Coast Guard is a $20 billion organization on a $13 billion diet. The Space Force is a $40 billion budget. The Space Force has a $10 billion PC&I budget. If we had a $3.4 billion PC&I reliable current year dollars, we could get after all the home port work that we just talked about, all the shore infrastructure recapitalization, and our current program of record with regard to ships and aircraft.
Okay, and I apologize for going over time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vice Admiral, Training Center Cape May has many projects in urgent need of completion, as you know, especially the barracks. I'm glad to see that $225 million is authorized in FY25 for the improvements to facilities at the training center, and an additional $60 million for the barracks for Phase 2. However, I've been getting mixed messages about the status of Phase 1, and I'd really like to clarify that. Vice Admiral Thomas, thank you again for being here today. We do appreciate you, even when we're giving you tough questions. That's part of the deal, right?
It's part of the deal.
You didn't expect to come here for the easy questions. Could you provide an update of the progress of Phase 1 of the barracks? Are there any problems in the bidding, the contracting process? And when can we expect construction to actually begin?
So we have not encountered any problems. We are just about to issue the request for proposal. I think, just to be honest with you, we asked for money in FY22, and it's a totally different market than what we have now. So we will do a design bid build RFP, and we will get what we can get for the $55 million that we have. I think that the Phase 2 will be more than $60 million if we are truly going to build what we need to build there. And then we need to continue to invest in Cape May because, as I've said earlier, the size of our future workforce, we cannot support it right now with the capacity that we have at Cape May.
So I'd love to know those numbers, and I understand what you're saying about Phase 1, and originally, actually, I understand it was going to be enough. Inflation, God knows, we know what inflation is doing to the country in general. But secondly, we then had approached you all and said, do you need more money? Originally, yes, and then you said, no, we're going to be okay. We're going to live with this amount. We're going to live under that budget. And I assume that's where you are now.
As I said, we're going to do a design bid build, and we're going to get what we get for the money that we have.
Okay, I have to think on that a little bit. And you assume, well, obviously, you're going to get what you're going to get, but it has to be adequate. It has to be appropriate. It has to fulfill the needs that we have.
Yeah, Congressman. If we can't get something that will be functional and suitable, then we will come back and ask for more money.
Right, which we had approached you on that, and you said you didn't think you would. So I just want to be clear. But if it's not good and it's not the right thing, and believe me, I don't like spending money. We've got a lot of debt, but we also have to take care of what's most important, which is our military, which includes the Coast Guard, which includes you all, which includes the biggest training center in the country, which is Cape May. If we need to do that, then we need to know that. We need to open those lines. Vice Admiral, we need to open those lines of communication.
I'm committed to keeping you informed, Congressman, on where we stand, and we will know more as we put out that RFP this summer.
Okay, so I'm really looking forward to the RFP, and then we should know a lot more, period, whether we need more money, et cetera, and the real time frame. We'd love to really get a start date here, and we hope to have that definitely by this summer. Training Center Cape May has prepared a draft strategic development plan which identifies potential projects over a 25-year horizon, and I know you're familiar with it. I've previously requested this information, and the Coast Guard has referred me to the traditional budget process through the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is fine, but let's be clear, Congress is a co-equal branch of government. It is essential as the oversight branch, and that we are, that we're able to communicate directly with agencies, and we absolutely appropriate to do so, on the budgetary matters that this Congress oversees. For my and this committee's legislative goals, it's important that we're able to see this plan, this 25-year plan, and work to provide for the proposed projects as the Coast Guard outlines them. It's a relatively simple request I'm making, Vice Admiral. It highlights, quite frankly, what's wrong with this government. Not with you, the government in general. We have to plan more. We can't just plan for the year or 2 years. It's good to have a 25-year plan. Doesn't mean that it doesn't change, but we need a plan. Congress has been missing a long-term outlook, and it's why we're in a terrible fiscal position. We as Congress should be able to see what such a critical asset as the training center Cape May needs over the next quarter of the century. And it's unclear to me, this is what's unclear, why the Coast Guard deflected this request to OMB. I want to make this real simple. I do. Will you commit to me and this committee, because it's important to the committee as well, that you will provide a copy of the strategic development plan of Training Center Cape May as soon as possible? We need to look at it. I know there will be changes in a quarter of a century, but it gives us an overview. It gives us a vision. Please respond.
I can commit to providing you our area development plan for Training Center Cape May and all the planning documents that go with it.
Which would include that 25-year plan.
Well, it's an
As
area
part of
development
it,
plan.
it's there. We know for a fact. So can you commit to that?
You know for a fact that we have a 25-year plan?
That is my understanding, yes. That's what we've been told when we asked, yes. We didn't make that up. We asked you folks, and that's what I was told.
Yeah, absolutely. If we have it, I don't know why we wouldn't share it.
Okay, so-
I'm not personally aware of it.
This is what I would ask. If you could personally look into that, if you have it, share it, and you've made that commitment already. And if you don't have it, please explain to me what planning documents you do have and why we received that incorrect information so that we know how to move forward.
Right, specific to Cape May. Happy to do that.
Specific to Cape May. I think it's a good idea in general, but I am going to be a little parochial here, so we're going to start with Cape May and hopefully expand it on.
I'll just tell you, Congressman, I share your frustration. One of the last decision memos that I've signed is one that will establish a shore infrastructure project office in our contracting shop so that we start buying shore infrastructure like we buy ships and airplanes. And that will give us the level of discipline that we need and that you expect.
And I hope that's a great goal. It's a great goal for you, for this committee, for all of us. I thank you. I thank you for being here. I yield back. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Okay. Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank both of you for being here. I appreciate it. I would like to thank each of the witnesses, which are you all, for your testimony. This subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much.